The world was still wrapped in a pale silence when the first blush of dawn spilled over the hills. In the Bronze Age, there were no roosters to crow in every homestead, no church bells to mark the hour, only the steady, patient rhythm of the land itself. The air was cool, touched with the faintest veil of mist that clung to the thatched roofs of the village. Smoke from the night's embers drifted lazily upward, catching the pale gold of the rising sun. The homes here were roundhouses, their walls woven from wattle and daub, strong enough to keep out the chill winds but simple enough to repair with the earth beneath one's feet. Thatch, tied tight with braided reeds, sloped steeply to shed the rain. In the stillness, you could hear the distant rush of a brook, the whisper of the tall grasses, and the occasional snort of a restless ox in the pen. A woman, her hair bound in a simple braid, stepped quietly from her home. In her arms she carried a clay vessel, carefully made by her own hands weeks ago, its surface smooth and dark from the heat of the firing pit. She knelt by the embers near the doorway and stirred them gently, coaxing the heat back into flame. Soon, the aroma of boiling grain would join the morning air, carrying the promise of warmth. Farther afield, the horizon brightened. The low hills were etched in soft light, revealing fields dotted with barley and emmer wheat. These were the lifeblood of the community, sown by hand, harvested by sickle, and guarded against both beasts and the turn of the seasons. In the Bronze Age, farming was a task shared by all. The rhythm of planting and reaping bound the people together more tightly than any spoken promise. As the sun climbed, life began to stir. A boy ran barefoot along the beaten earth path, chasing after the family dog. His laughter broke the hush of dawn, a sound as timeless as the light itself. An elder man. His beard long, his back slightly stooped, paused in the field's edge, leaning on his wooden staff. He gazed at the sky not just for beauty's sake, but to read the weather. The Bronze Age farmer understood clouds as surely as he understood his own heartbeat. From beyond the hedgerow came the soft tinkling of goat bells. A young herder led them slowly toward the pasture, his spear resting across his shoulders. The animals moved in a gentle, swaying rhythm, their breath clouding in the cool air. Bronze-tipped tools glinted faintly in the sun, a mark of the new age that had brought stronger metal than the stone of their ancestors. Such tools were prized, passed down, and sometimes even buried with their owners. And yet, despite these signs of change, life remained simple. Water was fetched from the stream in skin sacks or clay jars. Bread was baked over flat stones. Stories were told around fires that had burned in the same hearth for decades. The first full light of day now swept over the village. The fields turned to gold, the brook sparkled, and the thatched roofs caught the warmth. It was not a hurried time, nor a noisy one, it was a world where each moment unfolded at the pace of the earth itself. In this place, you did not race against time, you lived within it, breathing in its stillness, working in its rhythm. Somewhere, in the quiet between the wind and the soft shuffle of feet, the Bronze Age whispered its secrets, not in grand monuments or written words, but in the everyday life of a village greeting the first light over the fields. The sun had only just cleared the hilltops when the village hearths began to glow brighter, each one a beating heart of warmth and life. In the Bronze Age, fire was not something taken for granted, it was tended like a living being. The embers from the night were never allowed to die completely, a forgotten hearth meant cold hands, uncooked food, and an anxious search for a neighbor's flame. Inside the roundhouses, the smoke drifted upward through small gaps in the thatch, curling and twisting like pale spirits before slipping into the morning sky. The air was thick with the mingled scents of burning wood, damp earth, and the first porridge of the day. Grain, barley or emmer, had been pounded with stone querns before the sun rose, and now it simmered in clay pots suspended over the flames, the bubbling sound steady and comforting. Women moved with practiced grace, stirring pots with wooden paddles, feeding twigs into the fire, and pulling aside the embers to bake small flatbreads on heated stones. Each movement was quiet but purposeful, part of a rhythm that had been passed from mother to daughter for generations. Children, still wrapped in woven wool cloaks, lingered near the fires. The cold of the night had left their cheeks flushed, and they held their hands out to the flames, palms open, as if offering thanks. An elder woman sat nearby, her hair silver and her eyes keen despite her years. In her lap rested a bundle of dried herbs, not for food, but for the small rituals of the morning. She dropped a few into the embers, and the air filled with a fragrant smoke meant to guard the home from sickness and ill fortune. Outside, the central fire near the longhouse roared higher. This was where the men gathered before heading to the fields, their hands wrapped around steaming cups of broth or warmed beer brewed from last season's grain. Words were few at this hour, nods, small smiles, and the shuffle of feet were enough. Speech was saved for later, when the day's work allowed for it. The fires also served another purpose. In the Bronze Age, they were a signal, visible from afar, telling neighboring families that the village was awake, safe, and ready for the day. In winter, especially, the sight of smoke curling into the pale sky was a comfort, a quiet promise that life endured despite the frost. Near the edge of the village, a boy crouched over his own small fire pit. It was no more than a handful of twigs and glowing coals, but his concentration was fierce. His father had given him a task: learn to keep a flame alive. He leaned close, blowing gently, watching the ember brighten, then feeding it a sliver of dry grass until the first yellow tongue of flame appeared. His grin was quick but proud, a small rite of passage in a world where skill meant survival. By mid-morning, the fires had done their work. Bellies were warmed, hands thawed, and the village was in motion. The shepherds moved toward the pastures, the farmers toward their furrows, and the craftspeople toward their benches and tools. But no matter where the day would lead them, each carried the warmth of the morning hearth in their bones, a memory of the flickering light that began the day. In a world without clocks or alarms, the fires were the day's first marker, their glow a gentle summons to rise and join the living. And as the smoke drifted into the blue above, the village's life wove itself into the quiet, steady rhythm that had carried it through countless generations. By the time the sun reached its gentle mid-morning height, the village was alive with quiet industry. In a small clearing near the edge of the settlement, a man knelt before a low bench of smoothed wood, his hands already slick with clay. He was the potter, one of the few in the community whose work was as much art as necessity. The clay he shaped had been dug from the banks of the nearby stream days earlier, left to soak in water, and then kneaded with sand or crushed shells to give it strength. Now, under his touch, it transformed from formless earth into vessels that would hold the lifeblood of the village: water, grain, beer, and stews. His fingers moved with deliberate care, thumbs pressing, palms coaxing the shape upward in a slow spiral. There was no will, not here, not yet. The vessels were built by hand, using coils of clay layered one upon the other, then smoothed into seamless curves. The work was rhythmic, almost meditative. Each pot carried the signature of the maker, not in marks or initials, but in the subtle shape of the lip, the slope of the shoulder, the balance when held. Nearby, a group of children watched, their own small lumps of clay in hand. They imitated the motions, giggling when their creations sagged or split. The potter did not scold them, this was how learning began. Every skilled hand had once fumbled, and every pot that cracked in the firing pit was a lesson as much as a loss. When the sun shifted, the potter set aside his half-formed vessel and moved to the open firing pit. Inside, yesterday's pot sat cooling in the ash. He brushed one clean, revealing the deep reddish-brown sheen left by the flames. The clay was no longer earth, it was something new, something enduring. A good pot could last years, even decades, and in time, when it finally broke, its shards would still remain, scattered in the soil, telling a silent story of the hands that made it. But pottery was not only for utility. The potter sometimes pressed patterns into the soft clay before firing, zigzags, chevrons, spirals, or simple rows of dots. Some said these were just for beauty, others believed they held meaning, charms to protect the food or water kept inside. Whatever their origin, they gave the vessels a quiet personality, each one a little different from the rest. Beside the workbench, a shallow bowl of slip, liquid clay, waited. With a smooth stick, the potter painted it over a finished piece, sealing tiny cracks and smoothing imperfections. The faint scent of damp earth rose with each stroke, grounding the work in the land it came from. By midday, several new vessels stood in the sun, drying before they would meet the fire's test. The potter sat back on his heels, stretching his arms. His work was humble, yet every household depended on it. Without jars, there was no safe way to store water. Without bowls, no way to serve the morning porridge. His craft, like so many in the Bronze Age, was woven into daily life so tightly that its absence was unthinkable. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleated, and the voices of women drifted from the weaving shed. The world beyond the clay was moving on, but here, in this small circle of earth and ash, the potter's hands continued their quiet shaping, binding earth, water, and fire into forms that would carry the life of the village through another season. The sun had climbed higher now, its warmth spilling over the rolling fields and the low stone walls that marked the village's edge. Beyond those boundaries, the land opened into a patchwork of pasture and woodland, where the shepherd's day began in earnest. A young man, his wool cloak pinned at the shoulder with a small bronze brooch, walked steadily along a narrow dirt path. The air carried the faint scent of crushed grass and distant pine. Behind him trotted a small, wary dog, its eyes bright and ears flicking at every rustle. Ahead, the bleating of the flock rose and fell like a slow tide. Sheep and goats made up most of the herd, their coats thick and shaggy. Some were kept for their meat, others for milk, but many were valued most for their wool, the lifeblood of the village's weaving. Each animal was known to the shepherd by sight, if not by name. He could tell which ewe had a limp, which young ram was too bold, and which nanny goat would try to wander at the first chance. The shepherd carried a wooden staff, its top worn smooth by years of use. A small bronze knife hung from his belt, its edge carefully sharpened. Though the path was peaceful, the land was not without danger. Wolves roamed the deeper woods, and sometimes a lone fox would test the courage of the dog. The staff and the knife were as much a part of the shepherd's day as his sandals. The path wound past a low hill crowned with a ring of ancient stones. No one remembered who had placed them there, or why, but every shepherd knew the spot. Some left small offerings, a sprig of herbs, a carved bead, as they passed, asking for safe watch over the flock. The young man did the same today, tucking a few fresh clovers into a crack between the stones. By mid-morning, the pasture spread wide before him. The animals fanned out, grazing with the unhurried patience of creatures who have all the time in the world. The dog circled the edges, keeping a quiet order. The shepherd settled onto a flat rock, his back to the sun, and began to carve a small piece of wood. It was not work, exactly, more a way to pass the hours while the flock fed. The steady scrape of the knife and the rustle of grass blended into the warm hum of the day. From here, he could see far across the valley. Smoke still drifted from the village hearths, and in the distance, the glint of water marked the curve of the river. Somewhere, another shepherd's flock grazed, their bells faint but clear. These were the sounds of his world, not loud, not hurried, but constant and grounding. Occasionally, he would stand and scan the tree line, his eyes narrowing at any movement. A shepherd could not drift too deeply into daydreams. The flock depended on him, as much for safety as for guidance. Yet in the long, quiet stretches, the mind wandered, to the coming harvest, to the stories told by the fire, to the bronze brooch at his cloak that had belonged to his father. As the sun neared its peak, the shepherd rose and moved the flock toward a shaded glen where a small stream trickled over stones. The animals drank, the dog rested in the grass, and for a while, the only sound was water over rock. It was here, in these still moments, that the shepherd felt the weight of the land, its cycles, its patience, its unspoken promise to those who tended it well. By afternoon, the path would lead him home again. But for now, the day belonged to the open sky, the gentle tug of the herd, and the quiet watch of a shepherd's eyes over the land of his people. The shepherd's quiet pastures lay far behind the village forge, where the air shimmered with heat and the scent of smoke carried a sharper bite. The bronze smith's work was unlike any other in the settlement. It was a marriage of fire, metal, and skill, each depending entirely on the other. The smith stood bare-armed despite the warmth of the day, his skin marked by small burns and the sheen of constant labor. A leather apron hung heavy at his chest, its surface blackened by years of soot. Before him, the furnace roared, fed by charcoal stacked high beside it. A set of simple bellows, worked steadily by an apprentice, drove the fire hotter, until the heart of the flames glowed white-orange. Bronze was not born from the earth in its final form. It was coaxed into being, copper mined from the hills, tin gathered from far-off lands, each melted separately before being combined. The proportions mattered. Too much copper and the metal was soft, too much tin and it grew brittle. In the smith's hands, the balance was perfect, a secret carried in memory, not written words. Today, he worked on a new sickle blade. The molten bronze, poured carefully into a clay mold, hissed faintly as it filled every curve. The mold itself had been shaped days before, left to harden in the sun. When the metal cooled, the smith cracked the clay away, revealing the dull gleam of the new tool. It was not yet finished. The blade would need to be filed, hammered, and sharpened before it was ready for harvest. The forge was more than a place of work, it was a place of quiet reverence. Metal had a power about it, a sense of permanence that stone and wood could not match. A bronze axe might outlive the hand that wielded it. A spearhead could pass from father to son, carrying with it the stories of hunts and battles long past. In some burials, a smith's tools were laid beside him, not only as a mark of his trade, but as a promise that his skill would follow him into the next world. Nearby, the apprentice arranged finished pieces on a wooden bench, chisels, awls, pins for fastening cloaks, and small decorative discs that might one day be worn as ornaments. Each gleamed faintly in the shifting light, holding both beauty and purpose. When the day's work paused, the smith dipped his hands in a basin of water, letting the heat leave his skin. Outside, the sounds of the village drifted in, the lowing of cattle, the chatter of women at the well, the laughter of children running barefoot through the dust. But here, inside the forge, time seemed slower, the air thick with the weight of creation. As evening neared, the smith quenched the last piece in water, the hiss and cloud of steam rising like a ghost from the bucket. The glow from the forge dimmed, but the tools on the bench shone on, ready to serve the hands that would use them. In this way, the bronze smith's work tied every part of the village together, from the farmer's sickle to the hunter's spear. At the center of the village stood the longhouse, not the home of one family, but a space shared by all. Its tall, timber-framed walls rose above the smaller roundhouses around it, the thatched roof stretching like the wings of a resting bird. In the Bronze Age, such a place was more than a building. It was the village's memory, meeting point, and shelter in times of need. The air inside was cool and dim, the walls smelling faintly of smoke and dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters. A central hearth glowed low, its fire never fully extinguished. Benches of carved wood and woven mats lined the edges, while in the middle, a wide space remained open for gatherings, feasts, and the telling of news. By midday, people drifted in. A farmer entered first, carrying a bundle of barley heads to show the elder council, a sign that the harvest was ripening well. Moments later, two women arrived with baskets of fresh bread, still warm from the hearthstones, the scent trailing behind them like an invitation. The bronze smith stepped in, wiping soot from his hands, to exchange a newly made awl for a length of dyed wool from the weaver. Here, voices rose in an easy murmur. There were no market stalls, no formal ledgers. Trade was carried out through conversation, the value of each item weighed in the mind and agreed upon with a nod. Sometimes the trade was not goods for goods, but goods for help, a clay pot in exchange for a morning's work repairing a roof, a skin of beer for a hand in the fields. In one corner, a small group of children listened as a traveling storyteller spoke of distant valleys and seas beyond the horizon. His words painted images brighter than any dye, ships with sails like wings, hills covered in endless sheep, great stones standing in circles older than memory. The children sat wide-eyed, though the adults listened too. For news, for wonder, for the reminder that their world was part of something wider. The longhouse also served as the place of decisions. When disputes arose, over land boundaries, over animals, over words spoken in anger, they were brought here. Today, an elder woman with a carved staff heard the voices of two neighbors, speaking in turn. Her judgment was calm, her words deliberate. In a world without written law, fairness depended on the wisdom of those who held the respect of all. Above the low hum of talk, the occasional clatter of a bronze pin against a wooden bench, or the laughter of someone recalling a shared memory, gave the space its living heartbeat. Outside, the day passed, the sun climbed and began its slow descent, but inside, the longhouse seemed timeless. As evening approached, people departed in small groups, carrying their trades and their news back to their homes. The central fire was stirred and fed for the night ahead, its embers glowing like the steady pulse of the village. The longhouse would sleep in the dark hours, but it would be ready at dawn for another day's weaving together. Beyond the far edge of the village, past the grain fields and the grazing pastures, the land dipped gently toward a silver ribbon of water. The river had no carved stone banks, no bridges or walls, only the soft, shifting edge of earth and reed. It wound its way through the valley like a slow breath, carrying with it the quiet lifeblood of the community. In the Bronze Age, a river was more than a source of water. It was a road, a larder, a boundary, and a mirror for the sky. On its surface, the first light of morning danced in ripples. At midday, the clouds drifted there as if the water had stolen the sky's reflection. Today, two women walked down with baskets on their backs, clay jars slung against their hips. Their bare feet pressed into the damp earth as they followed the well-worn path, marked by the deep green of moss and the tangled scent of wild mint. At the bank, they knelt and dipped their jars, letting the cool weight of water fill them. The sound of it pouring in was soft but steady, a sound that had been the same for generations. Farther downstream, a man knelt in a shallow bend, his hands working a wide, woven trap he had set the evening before. When he lifted it, the sunlight flashed on silver, a half-dozen fish twisting in the air. He worked without haste, slipping them into a basket and resetting the trap. In the Bronze Age, fishing was not for sport, nor for waste, it was a measured task, taking only what the day required. On the opposite bank, a small group of children gathered lumps of dark, sticky clay from the water's edge. They laughed as it squelched in their fingers, shaping rough bowls and figurines that would crumble before nightfall. Their play was also practice, a first step toward the skilled pottery of their elders. The river gave more than food and clay. It brought reeds for thatching, willow branches for weaving baskets, and sometimes even small, polished stones that could be shaped into beads. In spring, its floodwaters nourished the fields nearby, leaving behind rich silt. In autumn, it drew flocks of birds whose feathers could be plucked for fletching arrows. It also carried the world beyond. Traders sometimes followed its course, bringing copper from the mountains or amber from the far northern coasts. They spoke in accents that twisted familiar words into strange music, and they brought with them stories of lands where the sun lingered far longer or vanished too soon. By late afternoon, the water's surface grew calmer, the wind easing. A heron stood still as stone at the shallows, its gaze fixed on the fish below. The women rose, jars now heavy, and began the slow walk home, their skirts brushing the tall reeds. The fisherman shouldered his basket, careful not to spill the day's catch. Even the children, their hands covered in drying clay, trailed behind, each carrying a small treasure, a rounded stone, a feather, a stick that looked like a spear. In a sheltered corner of the village, beneath the overhang of a long, low roof, the sound of the loom marked the slow heartbeat of the day. It was not loud, just the soft thump of the heddle, the whisper of the shuttle sliding through, the creak of wood as it flexed under practiced hands. The weaver's work was steady, almost meditative, but it carried the weight of the village's comfort on its threads. The wool came first from the shepherd's flocks, thick, greasy with lanolin, smelling of open fields. It was washed in the river until the water ran clear, then combed smooth with wooden carders tipped with thorns or bone teeth. The fibers, soft as clouds, were were then spun into thread by the turn of a drop spindle, the whirl keeping it steady as it twirled. Now, in the loom's frame, those threads became something more. The warp, long, vertical lines, hung like a curtain, each strand kept taut. The weft, the threads that moved side to side, was drawn through them, building the cloth row by patient row. It might be a plain weave, tight and strong for work tunics, or looser and softer for cloaks worn in the chill months. Nearby, small bowls of dye sat waiting, crushed madder root for deep reds, woad leaves for blue, and a pale yellow from the flowers that grew wild along the edges of the fields. The weaver would take the finished cloth and dip it carefully, letting the color seep into every fiber. When it dried in the sun, it seemed to hold the light itself. Children sometimes wandered close, drawn by the loom's quiet rhythm. They would sit cross-legged, holding scraps of wool and trying to twist them into cords. The weaver would smile but keep her hands moving, for weaving could not be rushed. A single cloak might take many days to complete, and the seasons waited for no one. Wool, once woven, could become almost anything. A warm wrap for a newborn, a hood for a hunter, a blanket for the elders in winter, or even bands to wrap around the legs for warmth on long journeys. Every thread, every color, held a piece of the land, the grass that fed the sheep, the river that washed the wool, the fire that warmed the dye. As the afternoon light slanted lower, the weaver paused, tying off the threads where she would begin again tomorrow. The half-finished cloth hung from the loom, its pattern simple but pleasing, the work of human hands shaping nature into something that would endure. In the quiet that followed, the loom stood still, the day's rhythm fading into the hush of evening. But its presence was constant, like the hearth, like the river, like the fields, a reminder that in the Bronze Age village, survival was not only about food or shelter, but about the warmth and care that wove the people's lives together, thread by thread. Amid the hum of work and the rhythm of daily chores, the laughter of children rose like bright notes on the wind. In the Bronze Age village, play was not separate from life. It happened in the same dusty paths, grassy edges, and open spaces where the adults worked. It was woven into the day, a lightness between the steady weights of survival. In the central clearing, a group of children knelt in the dirt, tracing patterns with sticks. They marked out rough circles, scattering small stones inside, a game of aim and skill, tossing pebbles to knock others from the ring. The rules were unwritten but fiercely remembered, enforced by the oldest among them with a seriousness that mimicked the elders' counsels. A little farther off, two boys chased each other between the roundhouses, weaving through the air-drying laundry like darting fish. One held a length of braided grass, pretending it was a spear, while the other carried a carved stick shaped like a bow. Their shouts echoed off the thatch, and a dog barked in delight, thinking itself part of the hunt. The girls, too, had their own games, though lines between boys' play and girls' play blurred often. Some practiced balancing on narrow logs laid across a shallow ditch, arms wide, daring each other to walk without falling. Others twisted wildflowers into bracelets, threading them together with nimble fingers that would one day spin and weave with equal skill. Sometimes, the games became practice for real life. A few older children took turns trying to light a small fire with flint and dry grass, crouched in serious concentration as their parents watched from a distance. When the first wisp of smoke appeared, a cheer rose, not too loud, for fear of scattering the fragile ember, but enough to mark the moment as a victory. Even the smallest joined in. Toddlers stumbled after the bigger children, laughing when they fell, their wool tunics dusty and grass-stained. Their mothers, working nearby, kept half an eye on them, but rarely interfered unless danger threatened. In the Bronze Age, play was also learning, about balance, about courage, about the feel of the world under bare feet. Beyond the village, the open meadow became a racecourse. Children lined up, their toes against a scratched line in the earth, and with a shouted signal, they were off, arms pumping, hair streaming, the earth thudding under their steps. The winner raised both hands, triumphant, while the others tumbled into the grass, panting and grinning. As the sun leaned toward evening, the games began to fade. The smaller children were called back for supper, The older ones wandered toward the edge of the fields, still talking in excited voices about tomorrow's rematch, tomorrow's hunt, tomorrow's daring walk across the log. The village returned to its quieter pace, but the echo of laughter lingered in the air. A reminder that even in an age where every season carried its own hard demands, there was room for joy, mischief. As darkness folded over the village, the air grew cooler, and the sharp scent of wood smoke drifted upward to meet the stars. In the open space between the houses, a fire burned, its heart a bed of glowing embers, its voice a steady crackle. People gathered around it in a loose ring, some sitting on low stools, others on woven mats or just the bare earth. Shadows flickered across their faces, deepening the lines of the elders and softening the features of the young. It was here, in the glow of the flames, that stories lived. In the Bronze Age, there were no books, no carved letters to hold the past, only the spoken word, passed from mouth to ear, from one generation's memory to the next. An elder, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, leaned forward so the firelight caught his eyes. He began not with words, but with a pause, a moment long enough to hush the murmurs, to let the night settle around them. Then, his voice came, low and slow, like the river in winter. He spoke of the first dawn, when the earth was cold and empty, and the sky held only darkness. Of how the sun, a golden hunter, chased the moon, his silver prey, across the heavens, and in their endless pursuit, the days and nights were born. His hands moved as he spoke, shaping the air into mountains, rivers, and forests. Children leaned closer, their faces lit in red and gold. They had heard this story many times, but each telling was different, colored by the elder's mood, the way the fire flared, or the sounds from the night beyond. In their minds, the figures of the tale were as real as the people beside them. When the elder's voice dipped low, the listeners leaned in, caught in the gravity of his words. He told of a great stag whose antlers held the stars, and of the hunter who followed it through the turning seasons. Of how the hunter learned that to take the stag would mean the end of the world's light, and so he chose to let it go, knowing he would never see it again. The fire hissed as a log shifted, sending a small spray of sparks into the night. Beyond the circle, the fields lay dark, the forest a deep wall of shadow. Somewhere an owl called, and for a moment it felt as if the creatures of the story might be watching, just beyond the reach of the light. When the tale ended, there was a silence, not awkward, but full, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Then the murmur of voices returned, low and warm. A mother rocked her child to sleep. Two friends exchanged quiet jokes. The elder leaned back, satisfied, knowing the story would live on, carried by those who had heard it tonight. In the Bronze Age, the fire was not only for warmth or cooking. It was the hearth of memory, the keeper of history, and the light in which the people saw their own lives reflected, glowing, fragile, and enduring against the dark. The sun rose slow and heavy, casting its first light across the rippling fields. Each stalk of grain caught the gold and swayed with the early breeze, their soft whisper carrying over the land like a secret shared only with the dawn. From the crest of a small hill, the village field stretched outward in neat, patient rows, the work of many hands over many seasons. For the Bronze Age people, these fields were more than food, they were survival itself. Each seed planted was a promise to the future, each harvest a repayment of last year's toil. The villagers tended to them with care that bordered on reverence, for they knew the soil was both a gift and a responsibility. Men and women moved slowly through the crops, checking for weeds or pests. A young boy followed behind his mother, carrying a small clay pot of water, pouring it carefully around the roots of the more delicate plants. Farther off, a pair of elders walked the edges, marking the boundaries with carved wooden stakes to keep stray animals from wandering in. The smell here was rich, a mixture of warm earth, green stems, and the faint sweetness of ripening grain. Insects hummed lazily above the stalks, while the wind brought the distant sound of the river. Every season told its own story in the fields. In spring, they had been bare soil, soft and dark under the plow. By early summer, green shoots had covered them in a soft haze. Now, in late season, they stood tall and heavy-headed, bowing under the weight of the kernels inside. Soon, the scythes would come, and the air would fill with the sound of cutting, binding, and stacking. In the distance, a group of children ran along the outer path, their laughter carrying through the air. They were chasing each other in a game that skirted the edge of the fields, careful not to trample the grain. Their energy, untamed and bright, seemed to belong to the land as much as the crops did. One of the elders paused in his work, leaning on his staff, and looked out over the fields. His eyes followed the way the wind moved across them, as if the earth itself were breathing. He remembered the years when the rains came late, when the stalks stayed thin and pale, when hunger sat heavy in the village. He also remembered the years like this one, when the sun had been kind, the rain steady, and the grain full and golden. The people knew the harvest would be good this year. The thought carried with it a quiet sense of relief, though no one spoke it aloud. In a world where the seasons could not be commanded, gratitude was often silent but deeply felt. By midday, the fields shimmered under the heat, and the workers retreated for rest. The grain swayed alone, whispering to the wind, waiting for the day when it would be gathered, threshed, and stored. The promise of another winter's survival sealed inside each kernel. The village awoke earlier than usual. Even before the sun had lifted itself fully over the horizon, the air was already alive with the sound of movement, footsteps on packed earth, the low murmur of voices, the creak of wooden carts being loaded. Market day came only a few times each season, and it was more than a chance to trade goods, it was the heartbeat of community life. From every house, people emerged carrying baskets woven of reeds, clay pots balanced on hips, and bundles wrapped in cloth. The smell of fresh bread drifted from one corner of the village, while the sharp, briny scent of cured fish came from another. The main path to the market square became a slow-moving river of neighbors, friends, and travelers. At the center of the village, an open space had been cleared, ringed by wooden stalls and simple tables. Here, traders laid out their goods, heaps of grain, jars of honey, thick woolen cloaks, polished bronze tools, and beads carved from bone and amber. Each item spoke of the hours of labor behind it, of the hands that shaped, gathered, or forged it. The voices rose as the day warmed. Bargaining was part of the ritual, carried out with a mixture of humor and firmness. A woman selling pottery argued good-naturedly with a man trading smoked meat. Children darted between the stalls, clutching sweet treats bought with a few spare kernels or a small carved token. At one end of the market, a group of traveling musicians struck up a tune on flutes and drums, their rhythms weaving through the crowd like a second current beneath the trading. People gathered to watch, clapping along or swaying to the beat. Nearby, an elder storyteller shared a new tale about the river spirits, drawing a small crowd of listeners, their eyes wide with wonder. The market was more than commerce, it was where news traveled, where alliances were formed, and where young people met eyes for the first time across the bustle. A family from a neighboring settlement might bring word of distant weather, or of a hunt gone well in the northern hills. A craftsman might share a new method for sharpening a blade, his hands demonstrating the motion as others leaned in to see. As the sun reached its height, the square glowed with heat. Traders shaded their goods with woven mats, while buyers sought the cool shadows at the edges. Deals were sealed with firm handshakes, and laughter echoed under the bright sky. By late afternoon, the crowd began to thin. People carried their purchases home, baskets now heavy, carts creaking under the weight of grain sacks and jars. The market square slowly emptied, leaving behind the dusty outlines of stalls and the fading hum of a day's energy well spent. In the Bronze Age, market day was not simply about buying and selling. It was a celebration of connection. Proof that the work of many hands, across many days, could be gathered in one place, shared, and sent back into the world to begin again. The path began where the last of the villages tilled earth gave way to the untamed green. Here, the air changed, cooler, thicker, and scented with the damp sweetness of leaves. Shafts of light broke through the canopy, falling like pale ladders onto the mossy ground. Each step along the woodland path was softened by layers of fallen leaves, their edges curling and dry despite the deep shade. This trail was older than memory. The people said it had been walked by their grandparents' grandparents, and perhaps by those who lived even before. It was narrow, winding like a stream between the trunks, and in some places, tree roots curled across it like the backs of sleeping animals. Birdsong followed those who walked here, sometimes close and clear, sometimes far and faint. The tapping of a woodpecker echoed in the distance, a steady rhythm that merged with the whisper of the wind through branches. Now and then, a squirrel darted across the path, its tail a quick brush of movement before vanishing into the undergrowth. Travelers took the woodland path for many reasons. Some were hunters heading toward deeper forest, their spears resting against their shoulders. Others were gatherers with woven baskets, searching for berries, herbs, or firewood. A few simply walked for the quiet, seeking the kind of peace found only where the village sounds could no longer reach. Along the way, small signs of life revealed themselves to the careful eye, a deer's fresh hoofprint in the mud, a feather caught on a bramble, the faint ripple of a stream heard before it was seen. In the Bronze Age, to know the forest was to know safety, food, and shelter, and the woodland path was the thread that connected all of it to the life of the village. The trees themselves seemed to watch the passage of each traveler. Some stood straight and tall, their bark silvered with age, while others leaned toward the path as if curious. When the wind picked up, the branches swayed and creaked, filling the air with a sound like the slow turning of a great wheel. By midday, sunlight streamed more boldly through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the path. The forest smell deepened, a mix of warm pine, cool earth, and the faint tang of wildflowers hidden in the grass. In such moments, the walk became more than a journey, it felt like stepping through a place where the present and the past brushed shoulders. The woodland path would lead, eventually, to the open hills and beyond. But here, in its quiet heart, time seemed to slow, as though the forest preferred to keep its travelers a little longer before letting them go. It began with a scent, that unmistakable freshness that drifted ahead of the clouds, carrying the promise of rain. In the distance, the sky deepened to a soft, smoky gray, and the first rumble of thunder rolled low and slow over the hills. The villagers knew the rhythm well. Children ran to gather firewood before it grew wet, while women checked that the grain sacks were sealed tight. Doors were pushed closed, and animals were coaxed into the shelter of pens and barns. In the Bronze Age, rain was both a blessing and a caution, and it was met with a quiet respect. Soon, the first drops began to fall, light, scattered, pattering softly against the thatched roofs. The sound was gentle at first, almost like the murmur of voices. But the clouds thickened, and the rain came steadier, the soft straw roofs hissing faintly under its touch. The air cooled, rich with the scent of damp earth and wet wood. Inside the houses, people moved more slowly, voices low, the day folding inward. Smoke curled from the central hearths, mingling with the smell of simmering broth. Some sat by the fire to mend clothes or sharpen tools, while others simply watched the patterns of raindrops chasing each other down the window skins. Outside, the world blurred. Paths became dark ribbons of mud, and the edges of the fields glistened with puddles. The sound of the rain filled every space, steady, endless, and soothing. Beneath the thatch, it was a music of protection, the soft assurance that the village was warm and dry while the sky gave its gift. By evening, the clouds began to lift. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then to the occasional drop that slid from the eaves. The thatch roofs steamed faintly in the cool air, releasing the earthy scent of soaked straw. Beyond the fields, the horizon was edged with pale gold light, and the village emerged once more into the open quiet, refreshed and ready for the days ahead. At the far edge of the village, where the fields met the first shadow of the trees, stood a low, rounded hut with a roof thickly thatched and walls darkened by years of smoke. This was the home of the healer, a place where the air was always warm with the scent of herbs and the quiet hum of slow, careful work. Inside, light filtered through a small opening in the wall, falling across shelves carved from rough planks. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, yarrow, sage, chamomile, and others whose names were known only to the healer. Some were tied with twine, others laid flat to dry on woven mats, their leaves curling and crisp. In one corner, clay jars held powders and crushed roots, their contents a mixture of sharp, sweet, and bitter scents. The healer's hands were skilled and steady. They ground bark into fine dust, stirred honey into warm water, and wrapped wounds with soft linen strips. Here, in the Bronze Age, medicine was a craft passed through memory, not written word. Every remedy was born from seasons of observation, trial, and quiet learning from the earth itself. Those who entered the hut often came in with slow steps, the fevered, the injured, the weary. The healers spoke little but listened well, their voice low and even, like the steady crackle of the small hearth in the corner. Sometimes the work was quick, a poultice pressed to a cut, a herb tea brewed for a cough. Other times, it was long and patient, sitting through the night beside a sleeping child or tending to an elder's pain with gentle hands. The air inside was thick with comfort, the soft steam of boiling herbs, the resinous burn of pine on the fire, the faint sweetness of dried flowers stored for winter. Outside, the wind might sigh through the grass or the rain might tap at the roof, but within the healer's hut, there was a stillness that seemed to hold the world at bay. When a patient left, it was often with a pouch of leaves or a small clay pot, instructions given in few but certain words. And always, there was that lingering sense that the hut was more than a place for sickness, it was a space where the knowledge of generations lived quietly, waiting to help those who sought it. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and ripe apples, a sure sign that the season had turned. The fields lay quiet now, their golden harvest safely stored in granaries and baskets. It was the time of year when the village came together to give thanks, not with solemn words, but with warmth, laughter, and shared food. Long tables of rough-hewn planks were set in the open space near the central hearth. Women carried baskets heavy with bread, still warm from clay ovens, and platters piled high with roasted game, wild greens, and thick slices of cheese. Bowls brimmed with berries preserved in honey, their deep jewel colors catching the fading autumn light. Men returned from the forest with bundles of firewood, feeding the great bonfire that would burn through the night. Sparks swirled upward into the crisp air, disappearing into a sky slowly filling with stars. Children darted between the tables, their hands sticky from honey cakes, their laughter ringing like birdsong. Musicians tuned bone flutes and stringed lyres, their soft notes weaving into the low murmur of conversation. When the first music began, it was slow, gentle, a rhythm for those still eating. Later, as the moon climbed higher, the beat grew livelier, feet stamping in time to the drums, the night alive with movement and joy. At the heart of the feast was not just the food, but the sense of plenty after hard work. Neighbors shared meat from the same spit, elders told stories of past harvests, and young lovers slipped away to walk beneath the falling leaves. When the fires burned low, people lingered, wrapped in cloaks, speaking softly as they watched the embers fade. In the stillness between the flames and the frost of dawn, the village felt bound together, not only by the harvest, but by the shared memory of another year's work, safely gathered in. Winter had settled in fully now, with snow lying in thick folds across the thatched roofs and the fields beyond. The days were short, the light pale and fleeting, but it was the nights that seemed to stretch endlessly, deep and still. The village moved at a quieter rhythm, each hearth a small island of warmth in the cold darkness. Inside the houses, the air was rich with the scent of burning oak and simmering stews. Families gathered close around the fire, their faces lit in gold and shadow as stories passed from one generation to the next. The old tales seemed to fit the season, sagas of ancient hunts, of gods who shaped the world, of spirits who wandered in the snow. Outside, the wind moaned softly against the walls, as if listening in. The stores from autumn's harvest were carefully portioned, smoked fish unwrapped from their salt, baskets of grain ground into coarse bread, and root vegetables pulled from straw-lined pits. Cups of warmed mead were passed between calloused hands, the sweet heat easing the bite of the cold. Beyond the walls, the night belonged to other sounds, the creak of frozen branches, the faint rustle of deer moving through the woods, the sharp cry of a fox somewhere in the distance. Above it all, the stars burned with a brightness only the coldest nights could bring, each one seeming close enough to touch. For some, these nights were for mending nets, carving wooden tools, or weaving cloth in the glow of the embers. For others, they were for quiet reflection, watching the flames dance while thinking of the seasons gone and those still to come. And so the long winter nights passed, slow and steady, as the village waited for the first soft signs of spring, a change in the wind, a songbird's call, or the faintest hint of green beneath the snow. The snow had thinned to patches now, retreating into the shaded hollows and the north-facing slopes. Each day, the sun lingered a little longer over the valley, and the air carried a softness that hinted at change. The village stirred with a quiet, hopeful energy. The long wait of winter was ending. Along the edges of the fields, the first shoots of green pushed through the damp earth, tender but strong. Children knelt in the mud to touch them, laughing at the feel of life returning to the land. The air was fresh with the scent of thawed soil and rain, and the sound of meltwater trickling along the ditches filled the spaces where winter's silence had been. The livestock, thin from the lean months, were led out from their pens to graze on the early grass. Their bells clinked softly as they moved, the sound drifting lazily on the spring breeze. Farmers walked the furrows with cautious eyes, checking the ground for readiness, testing the weight of the soil in their hands. Soon, the sowing would begin. In the woods, catkins swayed on bare branches, and the first blossoms appeared in hidden places, small splashes of color in the brown and gray. Birds returned in chattering flocks, filling the mornings with bright calls. The river, swollen with snowmelt, rushed along its banks with new force, carrying twigs, leaves, and the last fragments of ice out to the wider waters. At night, the fires still burned, but their heat was no longer a matter of survival. It was for comfort, for gathering, for marking the change of the season. Around them, people spoke with more laughter, their talk turning to planting, to building, to plans for the months ahead. Spring had returned, and with it came the old promise: the land would yield, the sun would warm, and life, in its endless circle, would begin again. Through every season, every shift of wind and sky, one thing in the village had never faded: the glow of the hearth. Its flames had been there before the first snowfall, before the first buds of spring, before the fields ripened golden under summer's hand. And as the year circled back on itself, the fire still burned, steady as a heartbeat. It was more than warmth. The hearth was the heart of the home, the gathering place where food was shared, stories told, and quiet moments passed without words. Children had grown from crawling to walking beside it, their faces lit by its flicker. The elders sat near it still, hands resting on their knees, eyes half-lidded in thought. Its smoke had curled into the rafters on stormy nights and drifted upward in thin ribbons under calm skies. It had welcomed travelers in from the cold and sent villagers out into the fields with a full belly and a warm spirit. It was the first thing lit in the morning, the last to fade at night. Even when the people left for the day, to fish the rivers, tend the crops, or gather herbs in the woods, the fire never stood alone. Someone always stayed to watch it, to feed it small sticks, to whisper to it as though it were an old friend. Now, as another year's cycle closed, the village was quiet. The moon hung silver over the rooftops, the wind was gentle, and from every doorway came the same soft glow. In each home, the eternal hearth burned on, carrying the warmth of the past into the promise of tomorrow. And so life in the Bronze Age village went on, season after season, year after year, bound together by the land, the people, and the enduring light of the fire.